Namaste and welcome everyone to Atharva forum. Today's talk will be a reflection on the contents of the book Sarvabhauma Sanatana Siddhanta by the Jagadguru Shankaracharya of the Puri Govardhan Mutt, Sri Swami Nishchalananda Saraswati Ji. Before we go any further, a gentle reminder to all the viewers, please subscribe to Atharva forum on YouTube. One may ask this question, why is this book relevant in our times today amongst so many other works available on Sanatana Dharma? And this is a question that the Swamiji himself answers in this book. So in our times, the society that we live in, it doesn't have a lot of belief and understanding on the foundational principles of Sanatana Dharma. So as the Swamiji says, इस समाज में सनातन सिद्धांतों के प्रति अपार अनास्था है, which means that a lot of us do not really believe in what is considered as the foundational principle or the Siddhanta of Sanatana Dharma. And this book hence is an attempt to present those Siddhantas or these foundational overarching principles so that the astha or belief on these principles increases and improves. It just not just increases and improves for those who consider themselves a part of the Dharma. It is also something that can stand as an ideal for those who look up to Sanatana Dharma otherwise. Personally, I hold a lot of respect for the unbroken Acharya Sampradayas and Paramparas of this land. And when I approach such Acharyas, I approach them with respect and humility, particularly when I am seeking to understand matters of profound importance like understanding the principles of Sanatana Dharma. It is in this pursuit that I came across this work and I keep going back to it occasionally to clarify my questions. It is a work that grows on you and takes a long time to read and understand. So the attempt here is really to give an overview of the contents of the book and also give a glimpse into the nature of the questions and answers that our own acharyas have grappled with in contemporary times. Consider this discussion on Purushartha, for example. Now, any discussion on Sanatana Dharma in our times will gravitate towards the question of Purushartha in no time. So Purushartha, as most of the viewers would know, is Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Now it is here that the Acharya says that the ideal way to look at it is that to make the Artha useful for life at large, the means of acquiring Artha needs to be Dharma compliant, which means that the adharmic means of acquiring Artha should be shunned in the interest of the long-term health and welfare of the society. Similarly, if you take Kama is seen as something that is deeply intertwined with the ideal of Artha, because essentially you are consuming Artha, consuming the wealth or consuming various objects of pleasure, so on, which are all at some level products of Artha. So our mode of consumption, which is called the Vishayopabhog, that also needs to be dharmic. This is again particularly important in light of our times today, where there are a lot of questions emerging on materialism, consumerism, etc. So this book delves deep into these aspects amongst many others. There's a very high focus in this book on the ideal of Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha in our times today. Another point that is elaborately discussed is the nature of the Atma. Now, a lot of predominant discourse in our time is what the Acharya calls Bhautikvad or Keval Bhautikta, which means somebody who says that all that is there to the body is just the body alone, and once you die, that is the end of the tale, so to say. And these are people who would then say that all that is there to seek is sensory pleasures, which is what can be seen, what can be felt, essentially what comes under the realm of what is called a Pratyaksha Pramana. Now, this is in contrast to the ideal that Sanatana Dharmis cherished for a long, long time, which is to say that there is an idea of an Atma that can persist beyond this life and this body. And if you believe that the only happiness that is to be arrived is purely sensory or carnal, and then construct a society around it, versus considering the idea of Atma, considering the idea of Janma, Punarjanma, Karma, so on, and then build a society around it with a Purushartha orientation, they are both going to be very, very different. And this difference seeps into every single arm of the society. It is not something that can be restricted to, let's say, the private sphere of an individual, just to his puja practices or just to his rituals, so on. And this is something that Hindus need to understand, that there is a difference between a purely materialistic way of architecting society, architecting life, versus a society that architects itself anchored around Dharma. And this is something that the Acharya emphasizes all through the book. There is another recurring theme in this book, which is what is called Abhinna Nimittotpadan Karanata, which means when you look at the idea of Parameshwar or Paramatma as seen in tradition, we attribute the Nimitta Karan, which is the efficient cause, and the Utpadan Karan, which is the material cause, both to one notion of Paramatma or Parameshwara. This is very different from how, let's say, a lot of other religions operate today. A lot of analogies and similes are used within our own traditional discourse to drive home this point. Few popular analogies here are repeatedly drawn to the reference in this book by the Shankaracharya to put across this point of how tradition, the Hindu tradition, looks at this idea of Abhinna Nimittodbadan Karanata. Now, if you take this example of an earthen pot or a clay pot, it stems from the clay, which means its srishti happens from the clay. It rests on the clay, which means when it is in the restful state, it is still based out of clay. And then when it gets destroyed, it again goes back into the clay. It is in a very similar way that Parameshwara is seen as the Uday, Nilay and Vilay, which means essentially the creation, the restful state, and then the destruction or the destroyed state of all living beings and Panchabhutas. Another analogy that is given here is that if you look at the whole universe or the Jagat as a sort of a machine or a yantra, then the yantrik, which is a mechanic, is also the same Parameshwara, and also the dhatu or the matter with which the mechanic is making the yantras, that is also the same Parameshwara. So that is how our tradition really looked at this whole process of creation, state, and then destruction. There are repeated analogies that one hears, let's say even in the Upanishads. One very popular analogy here is that of a spider, where you have the spider which creates the web. So the web and the spider cannot be distinguished, although one is a creator and the web is the product from that creator. And then this kind of a analogy kind of gets repeated, where this kind of instances where immanence and transcendence as perceived in Hindu tradition is seen recurring in various natural phenomena. Now this is something that the Swamiji repeatedly draws a reference to, because understanding this is very foundational to understanding Sanatana Dharma. Now in explaining the sources of Sanatana Dharma, which is a very important point, because a lot of times today, a lot of us, because we are in the modern times, and a lot of us are part of maybe paramparas that have long been broken, a lot of us are really searching for anchors, trying to understand what Sanatana Dharma is. And it is here that the Swamiji cites shlokas from Mahabharata's Anushasan Parva, where it is clearly written that for the sake of righteousness and protection of this world, there are three variants of Dharma which are created by Brahma. This happens whenever Srishti happens. So this is something that happens with creation, which is that there is this idea of Dharma stemming from Vedas, which is that the Dharma that is propounded in the Vedas is the highest. That is what is called Shruti. And then you also have another elaboration or commentary on Dharma, which is that Dharma which is propounded in Smritis and Shastras. So that is next in the order of importance. And then you have another variant, which is that of Shishtacharya, which means what the learned men practice. So tradition also defines who is a Shishta, and also there is a Shastra and community policing mechanism on who becomes Shishtavarti and who not. So essentially this is a view where Dharma is seen as Smritis and Shastras, and then Shishtacharya. Now, if you notice here, the way it is being portrayed, it is not that one of it originated on X date, the other followed, and then some other followed on some other date. This is something that is seen as something that is a part of the Abhivyakti of Brahma, which means Brahma is the creator God. He is somebody who is repeating this in a cycle, creation after creation. So there are cycles of creation that are happening, and every time this happens, it is Dharma gets established through these three sources, which is Smriti, Shruti, Smritis and Shastras, and then Shishtachara. Now, this is a very important point because it conflicts with our modern historical narrative, where we try to put some dates and our thinking on timing is always linear. But tradition really sees time in cycles, and then there is no notion of ending and beginning in the same way that we today see, let's say, in a linear time. Now, similarly, on the aspect of creation, if you look at how trees and mountains and various other such entities are getting created out of earth, they're all born out of earth. It is very similarly that tradition explains that all the movable and immovable beings, which is the Stavar Prani, Jangam Pranis, all of these originate from Paramatma, just the same way how trees and mountains originate from earth. So there is a parallel drawn between how creation happens as we perceive it through our eyes, and then trying to explain that it is just very similar to how this happens here. That is exactly how living or life gets created out of Paramatma. Similarly, this is, let's say, an analogy that was drawing to how creation happens with earth, which is one of the Panchabhutas, Bhumi. Now you also have another such analogy drawn where water is the life-giving and life-saving force for a lot of beings. it is very similarly, just like how water is the life-giving and life-saving force, so is Parameshwara for all of us. Similarly, how Agni, which is fire, how we can destroy, so can Parameshwara also destroy. So it is how on Panchabhutas operate. It is the same analogy that is drawn to say that just as how Panchabhutas operate, let's say today on you as a being, it is exactly how Parameshwara operates on all of the beings, all of the pranis and all of Panchabhutas as well. This is a very important point. When we look at how, when we think of creation, we always perceive a separation between creator and his creation. But all of these examples are really trying to say that that separation is not something that is really respected in tradition, and there is a way in which all of that is addressed to say that there is no difference between the creator and his creation. Now, another Sarvabhauma Sanatana Siddhanta here is that of pravritti, nivritti and nirvritti. So what this is pravritti is what is an outward action or worldly affairs, which is what when senses and actions are directed towards the external. So we also have something called nivritti, which can be more of a contemplative life, looking inward and things like that. And then there is also this notion of nirvritti, which is the end state, like a moksha or mukti, as tradition calls it. What the Shankaracharya says here in this book is that there is one Sarvabhauma Sanatana Siddhanta, which is this, that the pravritti should happen based on Shastras, which is that Shastri Riti se Sampadit Pravritti, which means that whatever you do in terms of your external actions, that should still be compliant with Shastras. Now, what it does is that when your Pravritti Marga is also compliant with Shastras, that through that Marga, you will be led to the Nivritti Marga, which is the contemplative or inward-looking kind of a mode. And from that Nivritti Marga, you go to the end state, which is Nirvritti, which means that state of Mukti. So it is seen as a continuum where there is a Shastra Sammat Pravritti Marga, and through that Shastra Sammat Pravritti Marga, you go to Nivritti, and from Nivritti, you go to Nirvritti. Again, this is very different from some of the modern Hindu commentators who try to compartmentalize these two to say that don't bother so much about Pravritti, let it happen the way it is. Let's focus on Nivritti, which is let's focus on the contemplative mode, let's focus on the inward mode, so on. But in terms of a Sarvabhauma Siddhanta, what Puri Shankaracharya is saying here is to say that there is a continuum, they're all related to each other. The Pravritti Marga also should be Shastra Sammat, and through that Shastra Sammat Pravritti Marga, you go to Nivritti, and then from Nivritti, you go to Nirvritti. So this is very different model from the compartmentalized model that is today fast getting popular. And hence the Acharya's emphasis on continuum is very, very important. Similarly, when we talk about Pravritti, a lot of it is really about the worldly life. So when you talk about the worldly life, the question of Artha always comes, which is the pursuit of wealth. Again, here today, because of the, let's say, the colonial condition or the modern predicament, a lot of us have a mindset today, which is to say that let's keep all this aside, let's get rich first, which is to say that let's accumulate Artha first, and then we can figure out about Dharma and everything else. Now, that is a flawed construct, primarily because the way tradition looked at both the means and the ends are equally important. And even when you reach an end, how you reach there in terms of the pursuit of what is the source that enabled you to accumulate that wealth, all of that hence gets very important. So here the Shankaracharya quotes a couple of shlokas from Srimad Bhagavatam, where it is elaborated on this particular line of thought, where the idea of Artha is contrasted with the idea of 15 different anarthas, which means that in the pursuit of Artha, you may go astray because you are diverted or consumed by these 15 different anarthas. Now, these anarthas are really concepts like theft, violence, speaking lies, duplicity, lust, anger, quarreling, enmity, faithlessness, envy, so on. So these are all, let's say, qualities that are undesirable, and once men are consumed by these undesirable qualities, then they end up falsely ascribing value to these qualities, and you'll end up accumulating undesirable material wealth. And this is something that this whole moral predicament is something that runs in contrast to today's modern economic model, where it is really loudly proclaimed that greed is good. And you have then Bhagavatam, which is saying greed needs to be avoided because it is an anartha that pollutes the pursuit of artha. So here there is this ideal that all wealth is not something that we can engage with. So there is a certain kind of wealth which can be engaged in the service of the Lord, and there is a kind of wealth which is really adharmic, so to say. So this differentiation is very, very important. Now there are other such shlokas in the Srimad Bhagavata which the Swamiji again alludes to, which is to say that, so he says, dhan ka phal hai dharma, which means that the only proper fruit of acquired wealth is in dharma, and it is on the basis of which that one can acquire a philosophical understanding of life, and this eventually matures into the perception of an absolute truth, and thus a moksha from all the suffering. So materialistic people, however, they may try to utilize their wealth simply for like sensory pleasures or advancement of their own family situation, so on. And it is here that the Bhagavata cautions people that death is going to be certain, your material body is frail, and there is going to be an end around it. So there is a whole body of philosophy here which is trying to say that look beyond sensory gratification, look beyond mere wealth accumulation. And it is here that the Shankaracharya says it is this ideal of dharma that needs to moderate or police the accumulation of artha. And this is something, again, you can see in multiple sources. So the Swamiji also quotes from Mahabharata Shanti Parva, where it is again a very similar notion that one sees here, where it says that the wealth that is obtained as you follow your dharma, that alone is the real or true wealth. And wealth that is obtained through adharmic means, that needs to be discarded. And it also says that one should never let go of dharma in pursuit of artha. So these are really cases where there is a very distinct proposition being made that there is a dharmic way of accumulating artha and there is an adharmic way of accumulating artha. It is not that all artha is artha, so it is good. So there is really a very conscious effort that is being done to say that this kind of pursuit is welcome, this kind of pursuit is good, please avoid this kind of pursuit, this is bad. Now, if you contrast it to the way that we operate today, there is really no policing, no moral judgment that is really ascribed to any different model of pursuit of wealth. We are kind of operating in a model today where we have just taken dharma out of the equation and then we are saying, let's just accumulate artha, let's satisfy kama, and then we'll see. So that is something that the Swamiji is repeatedly cautioning against in this book through various examples. So again, quoting from another shloka from Srimad Bhagavata, it is very clearly enunciated there that dharma is meant for ultimate moksha and it should never be performed for material gain alone. However, that somebody who is, let's say, engaged in dharma anushthan or practice of dharma, it doesn't mean that they are not going to gain anything materially. It is more of whatever you gain materially, you try to satisfy your senses to the minimum and then take the excess, put the excess again in the service of dharma. So it is kind of a cycle that repeats where your focus is on dharma anushthan and not necessarily in terms of a pure consumeristic or sensory gratification kind of an approach. So that is where you can see Mahabharata, you can see Bhagavatam and all these places where that is being emphasized again and again. Now, when we talk about dharma, when we talk about artha and kama moksha, in our terms, in worldly parlance, obviously one question comes up, which is of Jivan and Jivika, which is that of life and livelihood. Again here, the Shankaracharya quotes from Yoga Vasishtam or Nirvana Prakaran from the Yoga Vasishtam. So what he says here is that this particular shloka really says that men should work honestly on earth to earn their bread, and you take that much of food that is required for your sustenance or that is required for your prana raksha, and that's all that you need to do. And once your body is nourished, your focus should be on tattva jijnasa, which means your focus should be on inquiry after those truths that are absolute, that are permanent, and not focus more and more on sensory gratification. So this is something, again, just as in Bhagavata, just as in Mahabharata, you can also find it in Yoga Vasishtam. So here, the Shankaracharya says that if somebody adopts a very pure materialistic perspective, that a very charvaka drishti, so to say that there is nothing beyond this body or nothing beyond this one life, you only live once, that sort of a model, then you end up with this thing which says that jivika jivan ke liye hai and jivan jivika ke liye hai, which means to say that life is for livelihood and livelihood is for life. There is no other ulterior purpose. It is just about consumption and sensory gratification, so on. However, the dharmic drishti will say this, that jivan jivika ke liye nahi hai, jivika jivan ke liye hai, which means livelihood is for life, but life is not just about livelihood alone. Jivan hai, जीवन धन जगदीश्वर की अभिव्यक्ति के लिए, which means to say that the purpose of life is to understand the ulterior purpose of Ishvara, Paramatma, Jagadishvara, so on. So this is something that a Bautikvadi or a materialistic will have a hard time to understand, because he refuses to appreciate this other realm of Ishvara, Paramatma. So this distinction is very, very important, because a lot of times, again, given the context of our times today, that we are perhaps not as rich as we should have been in strictly monetary terms. There is a good amount of poverty, let's say, in the Samaj today, as it might not have been there in the past. And it is in this context that there is an extreme focus put on the pursuit of wealth. And it is here that such verses become very, very important, that don't get lost merely in pursuit of accumulating more and more. And there's a lot more to life. So another topic which is important here in this context, in the context of Sanatana Dharma broadly, is this whole idea of creation, of Avatarvad, of Itihasa, our sense of past, so on. So this is again something that conflicts very much with our lives today, where there is a historical narrative on Dharma and Hinduism, which is very much in conflict with the traditional narrative. And this particular part is where Puri Shankaracharya really excels in this book, because this is something that gets very, very little attention outside of the traditional discourse or traditional Guru discourse space. Because a lot of discourse outside of the traditional realm, when people look at their past, they really apply the historical lens, and everything is really seen within the contours of the historical method or the scientific method. And it is here that Puri Shankaracharya says that you have to look at the Aitihya Tattvaki Darshanikata, which means how do you look at sense of past, and how does that fit into our knowledge system, into our darshanas, and into our whole Srishti Vijnana. So in this particular part of the book, there's a lot of focus in trying to understand various stories that are part of our Puranas, various stories that are part of our Itihasas, and then trying to explain how one can understand these stories without having to suspend their belief or rationality and things like that. So what Swamiji tries to do here, he says that firstly, you have to, if you want to understand the discourse of the Vedas, discourse of the Smritis, discourse of Puranas, Itihasas, so on, then first you have to understand what is called the Satchidananda Swarup of Paramatma. And you should also understand this Abhinna Nimittotpadan Karan, which is what I elaborated at the start, that the difference between the creator and the creation is not something that really exists in the same way as it exists, let's say, in other religions. So you have to first understand that. And then when you talk about Avatarvad, you have to fully digest and understand what it really means. What does it mean when you say that a particular avatara happened, or a particular cycle of avatars keep repeating again and again? And you should also understand this notion of Adi Daiva, which is to say that there is a particular form where the Parameshwara manifests into a Daivic form. So you have to understand that. So there is an Adi Daivad, there is an Avatarvad. So you have to understand these two, and it is only then the Puri Shankaracharya emphasizes that only when you understand Avatarvad and when you understand Adidaivad, it is only then that you can understand Bharati Itihas, which means to say that to understand our sense of past, to understand our Itihasas, you should appreciate all of this. You should appreciate the notion of Paramatma, you should appreciate the notion of Satchidananda Swarup, you should appreciate the notion of Abhinna Nimittotpadan Karanata, you should appreciate Avatarvad, you should appreciate Adidaivad. Now, all of this, if you look at it, is outside of the bounds of what we traditionally call as the history. Go deep into it, it again goes back into this fundamental question of how to understand Surya or sun god, Pele. So here, there are a long list of examples that Puri Shankaracharya gives to elaborate this point, because it is something of a very profound importance. Because unless you know who you are, which means unless you understand your past, you can really not understand your tradition, your identity, your practices, so on. So here, the Swamiji gives an example of Surya, which is the sun god. Lord Rama, he was born into a particular dynasty, which is called the Surya Vansh, or the solar dynasty. And Surya, or the sun god, is born in the form of Vivashan from Kashyapa and Aditi. So this is a particular formulation where you are saying that Surya or sun as a god, or as in a particular avatar rupa, was born for Kashyapa and Aditi. So here is where Puri Shankaracharya elaborates that when you look at sun from a very, let's say, a physical plane, you see an Adi Bhautik Roop, which is what you see with the eye. Then of course, there is another Roop, which is also the Adhyatmic Roop of Surya, which is what, let's say, one can feel or perceive when they are doing into upasanas, rituals, or any sort of worship and puja, so on. There is also an Adi Daivik Roop of him, and there is also an avatar roop of Surya. So without accepting all these, have, let's say, the stories, says, the origin stories, impossible to appreciate of this idea of a Surya Vamsha. Again, that whole you cannot story, appreciate this idea of a Surya Vamsha, neither can you appreciate the fact that Rama's avatara happened in that particular Vamsha or lineage. Similarly, you also have, let's say, the stories, the origin stories of Sugriva, of Karna, who again, that whole story, if you go deep into it, it again goes back into this fundamental question of how to understand Surya or sun god. So again, the historical lens is simply insufficient to account for these stories or narrative. So what typically is adopted in these cases is that we are asked to believe that these are just allegories, these are just metaphors, and these are just fairy tales, myths, legends, and just ignore that as a part of like creative storytelling and just focus on facts. That is typically a historical narration on understanding a sense of past. And what the Shankaracharya is saying here is quite an opposite formulation there, to say that there is no reason why you need to dismiss all these conceptions, and they are very much understood within the Dharmic or Sanatana discourse, so long as you understand this fact that there is an Adibhautik group of Surya, there is an Adidaivik group of Surya Deva, there is an Adidaivik group of Surya Deva, and then there is also an Avatarvad. So if you look at the notion of Surya or sun god from all these four perspectives, there is really no reason why somebody will have difficulty in trying to appreciate this fact that an entire dynasty has spawned from Surya or the sun god. So this kind of an examples are a plethora. If you look at our epics, if you look at Mahabharata, if you look at Itihasas and Puranas, you'll find so many more of these. And some of them are cited in this book by Puri Shankaracharya to drive home this point of why we need to look at our own gods and our own stories from a multifold perspective, as I just explained. So if you take the case of Atri, Atri is known as the Putra of Brahma, and then Chandra or the moon god is born of Atri. So again, here you have a story that builds on how the lunar lineage or the Chandra Vamsha started, and it is in this Chandra Vamsha that Krishna's avatara has happened. So again, here Puri Shankaracharya emphasizes this fact that you have to appreciate Chandra Devka avatar vigraha, which means to say that moon, again just like sun, has multiple forms. So there is this form where there is an avatar of moon, and that is very much possible in the traditional realm, so long as you acknowledge that Atharva is something that exists and that is real and is possible. So here there is another very popular story of origin of Kanda or the god Kartikeya. So in this story of Kartikeya, again, you would see a lot of multiple actors in that origin story. You have Lord Shiva, you have Parvati, you have Ganga, you have Agni, you have Kritikas. So all of these are really outside of the historical realm, but all of these are very much real and very much true, so long as you look at the Adidaiva, Adibhuta and Adhyatmik and Avatarvad sort of a lens onto it. And this is something that also plays out in, let's say, the story of Uma or Parvati, who is the daughter of a mountain god, Himavat or Himavant or the Himalayas. So again, there a very rationalist perspective can question how can a mountain give birth to a particular human form, right? But again, this is something where if you look at Himavat or Himavant as an avatar or a particular incarnation of one particular form, that is very much possible and that is very much explainable in the traditional discourse. This is something, let's say, somebody can see even in the Janma Rahasya or Janma Vrittant of Bhishma, where Bhishma is born of a Ganga, and Ganga again has multiple forms. There is, of course, the material form of just a river. There is also the Adidaiva form. There is also an avatar form. So even here, you can see that this kind of plays out all across, where in the story of Bhishma, in the story of Parvati, in the story of Kartikeya, you would continue to encounter into this particular multifold formulation. Now, it is not just limited to, let's say, particular gods like Shiva and Parvati or to Kartikeya, so on. What the Shankaracharya emphasizes in this book also is that these kind of incarnations kind of happen to various other entities as well. For example, Shakuni is widely acknowledged within tradition as Dwapar or Dwapar Yukka Roop, and Duryodhan is widely acknowledged as Kali, which is the Kali Yuga. So he is acknowledged as a personification of the Kali Yuga as an epoch, and you have Shakuni as a personification or an incarnation of the Dwapara Yuga. So again, this is something that is very much possible if you understand this whole idea of avatar, this whole idea of Adidaiva, so on. And there are also, outside of this discussion on Atharvas, there is also this whole notion of, let's say, fantastical births that happen. For example, I mean, these are stories which are, let's say, sound very incredible, unbelievable, or irrational to a very, let's say, convent educated or English educated mind. So here, Puri Shankaracharya gives the example of Aurva Rishi, so who is the son of Arishi and Chavan Muni. So in this case, he is called Aurva because he was born out of the uru or thigh of his mother. So again, this seems very hard to believe. But here, Puri Shankaracharya gives a long list of explanations to explain that there are so many forms of creations that are happening around us. And again, here he's really quoting from several traditional sources like Mahabharata, Bhagavata, Gita, so on. So let's say even if you take how nails grow from our body, how hair grows from our body, these are all, let's say, processes of creation where the body is sentient, but the nail or the hair is not sentient. Similarly, there is, let's say, this what is famously called kasturi, a kind of a perfume, which is created from a musk deer. So these are cases where all sorts of creation happens today in nature. And it is here that just because when you hear of something, at that moment it might appear to you fantastical, you need not dismiss it, saying it shouldn't have happened or it shouldn't have happened or it is a fairy tale. Shankaracharya also gives this example of what is popularly called as nothing grows under a banyan tree. But then the banyan itself continues to nurture itself there. So even there, while you can say that some life forms don't originate under a banyan tree, but there are other life forms, which is the banyan tree itself, which continues to nurture and originate there. So we have to study and understand various forms of creations that are happening, and that is when you'll really understand how these kind of creations are understood and acknowledged within tradition. Again, here there are parts of the stories which today are very hard to digest for our rational mind, and it is here again that Shankaracharya emphasizes that Shapabal, Yogbal, Tapobal, Nadbal, so on, or various forms of strength or various forms of Shaktis which can result in promotions or demotions with respect to the life forms that a person can take. So it can't be dismissed merely as hearsay. So there is this notion that the sage Agastya's sharp has resulted into Nahusha, the king, turning into a snake. And there is also this a very beautiful story of Jalandhara's wife Vrinda becoming the plant Tulasi. And as a part of that interlocution, Vishnu becomes a Shaligram. So these are the stories that galore all across our Puranas and epics, and these cannot be dismissed as mere hearsay, because so long as you have Asta and tradition, you would really believe in this fact that there is something called a Yog Bal, there is something called a Tapo Bal, there is something called a Sharp Bal. So long as you are understanding the fact that there are other models of Shakti, there are other models of divine intervention, you will really not have a problem in understanding these series of Punarjanma, Purvajanma, and then people taking a birth into different life forms and then coming back to the human form, or from the human form becoming something else, and then doing that sort of a journey across various type of life forms. So here, Puri Shankaracharya again draws a lot of attention onto this beautiful Janavrittant of Kartikeya or Skanda, where, as I mentioned earlier, there is this whole interplay that happens between Shiva, Parvati, between Ganga, between Kritikas, and then between Agni. So here, several Devas and Devatas are involved. And although all of this is there to explain the origin story, there are still people who might just negate or ignore the Purusha Rupa of our gods like Skanda or Kartikeya. And here, Puri Shankaracharya cautions that you should never lose belief on this particular Purusha avatar or a form where they have taken a Rupa on this earth and then conducted their Leela. So here he says that if somebody loses faith on these particular stories around the birth or the origin of their gods, then eventually that really translates into a loss of faith into the, let's say, the Puja Pratishtha of the avatar murtis in the temples. So if you stop believing that your gods can take these forms of avatars or your gods can take this form of a Purusha, then you eventually lose a faith in the whole idea of the Vigraha avatar in a temple, the whole idea of pujas that are conducted around that particular avatar. You also lose faith in the stories of their valor, in the stories of their let's say, their Vivaha and everything else around their life. And this eventually translates into your loss of faith on the Shruti Smriti Pramanikata. So if you start losing faith in your gods because you're trying to look at them from a very, let's say, a rational or a historic kind of a lens, then eventually you'll start losing faith into your tradition as whole itself. And which is why here in this book, Puri Shankaracharya tries to emphasize again and again that you should continue to understand your tradition from the lens of Adhyatmikta, from the lens of Adibhautikta, from the lens of Adidaivikta, and also Atharva. So Vishnu Puran, for example, there is a one particular shloka in the Vishnu Purana where this sort of a cycles of creation is repeated, where we have this notion of Vedic deities, 33 Vedic deities, and there is a whole cycle which repeats that there is a Sambhavanti Yuga Yuga element there, which is essentially to say that these are the deities or godly forms that take a birth or repeat their recurrence in every Yuga cycle. Just as how there is a sunset and a sunrise every day, for every yuga, you would see this Utpatti and then the Samhar happening, where these devatas kind of start and then end, then again start, then again end. So this is a cycle that kind of repeats. So these are, let's say, formulations that are very, very hard to understand for somebody who is hardwired into the linear notion of time. But somebody who is brought up in the traditional mold and who is accustomed to thinking in cycles, they'll really not have any problem in trying to understand or appreciate this particular notion. Everything that is sentient is really looked at from an Adidevik Drishti in tradition. So here, Puri Shankaracharya emphasizes that when you look at a particular object, you are always, when you are looking at it from an Adidevik Drishti, there is always an aspect of Chetana or Chaitanya in it. And it is really for this reason that we worship various kinds of objects, which is the astras, the shastras, and chakki and chulha as well, which is to say that in the Hindu mindset, really everything becomes an object of worship because there is a way in which from the Adidevik Drishti, everything is sentient or has such a manifest or unmanifest Chaitanya within itself. And this kind of Drishti is something that is very unique to our faith today compared to, let's say, many other faiths that are prevalent in our times today. So again here, when you look at how this particular manifestation is happening, we also have this notion, let's say if you look at the Janma Vrittanta of Kunti, it is told that she is the incarnation of Siddhi. If you look at the Janma Vrittanta of Madri, it is told that she is an incarnation of Dhriti. And Gandhari was an incarnation of Mati. So there is, of course, the stories around Pradyumna being the incarnation of Kama. The traditional perspective really doesn't limit this model of Avatarvad, of incarnations. It is not just limited to, let's say, a particular kind of gods. It is really all expansive, where even Kama, Siddhi, Dhriti, Mati, which a very rationalistic mind would say they are just feelings, but even they have their own trajectory of sorts when you look at them from a traditional lens. So it is important for us as Sanatanis to have asta or belief in our own traditions and not to dismiss all these as ahistoric or dismiss all of them as allegories. And that is really where that Shankaracharya says that Sanatan Dharmiyam ka itihas Sanatan itihas hai, or Sanatan itihas Sampurna Samsar ka Purva itihas hai. So if you look at this expansive formulation, which is to say that what we talk as our sense of past is Sanatan, which it is eternal, and it is not just our own story, it is the story of the entire creation of the samsara and of the universe. So this kind of a formulation needs a lot more asta or a lot more belief in how tradition looked at a sense of past, and it is very difficult to understand this otherwise by using any other lens. And it is here that from the Mahabharata, Puri Shankaracharya quotes another shloka. It is very explicitly told that Itihasas and Puranas are extended commentaries of what is present in Shrutis or Vedas, and those who are not conversant or unacquainted with the true essence of Itihasas and Puranas, they are shunned by Vedas. In fact, Vedas are positively afraid of exposing themselves to that kind of people. So there is a very explicit acknowledgement of this whole continuum between Itihasas, Puranas and Vedas. And in this book, again and again, you'd see Puri Shankaracharya emphasizing this notion of deities, of Avatarvads, of stories of creation, and how all of that is not disconnected with the core teachings of the Shritis and Smritis. Now, another aspect that typically when a modern mind looks into this, there is another very conflicting point that emerges when you look into these, let's say, stories of beginninglessness, endlessness, and cycles of creation and destruction. A modern convent-educated mind really it just hits into our head to say that, hey, then what about evolution? So this is another piece that is again dealt with very beautifully in this book, where there is indeed a Sanatana Dharmic Drishti of looking at Vikas and Has, which means to say that growth and decline, or progress and regress, or let's say some form of an evolution and an involution. So here, this part of the book is called Vikas or Has ki Shastri Mimansa. So it is really a Shastri Mimamsa being done on these ideals of growth, decline, progress, and regress. So the very simplistic notion we have of evolution from our textbooks today is that of a linear progression of and then a monkey man and then a man. So this is a kind of a linear notion that all of us have been taught in schools as a theory of evolution. Of course, I mean, there's so much research that happened on those topics over the years, and there's a lot more detail and a lot more nuance there. But typically, this is a notion that we carry, that man came from monkeys, and then that's how it is. But the traditional perspective is very interesting, because unlike many other religions, the Hindu notion, it really doesn't reject this particular formulation of this sequence of evolution. All it says is that just like how a monkey becomes man, a man can also become a monkey. A monkey can become a tree. A man can become a tree. Trees can become mountains. So there is a kind of a whole sentient being construct that we have. And there is a sequence of janmas and purva janma, parampara that we see there. And all of this we attribute to what is traditionally called guna karma vaichitri, which means all of this is a function of gunas, of karmas, and how consciousness at large operates. This is very different from a very simplistic textbook notion of evolution. So although the Hindu tradition respects this idea that one being can emerge from another being, the way it looks at it is very different from a very simplistic notion of evolution that we have today, where we, let's say, put a definite timestamp that this is when creation started, and another definite timestamp to say that this is when monkeys were there, and another definite timestamp as a sequence to say that this is when humans emerged. So the traditional perspective is a bit different, a bit more elaborate, in that it looks at everything in terms of cycles and multiple parallel running sequences of evolution and involution, progress and regress happening all at the same time. So that is something that perhaps needs to be understood by a lot of Hindus if they were to, let's say, address these schisms in the mind today, because a lot of us have a modern secular education, and then we get into tradition through, let's say, the channels of our family or our own prarabdha, or because of some other life event. But there's always this part of our brain which functions as a modernist or a modern mind, and it is always trying to reconcile these notions with tradition. But the traditional notion is really more expensive and more elaborate, and it should perhaps be understood on its own terms and on its own right, and not trying to explain it through an external lens of sorts. Now, of course, I've spoken a lot on so many aspects of creation, of Atharva, of Itihasa. I'm sure there are some people who must be wondering, but there's so much of discussion on Dharma here, but what about Varnashram Dharma? What about Samanya Dharma and so on? So I'm not going to delve too deep into those aspects in this talk because they perhaps need a lot of elaborate treatment. But suffice to say that Puri Shankaracharya is representing a certain parampara, and his duty is really to represent the position of tradition on these matters. And he says this, that in Sanatana Dharma, we have this notion of Kshama, we have a notion of Ahimsa, and many other such notions, which are all bucketed under Samanya Dharma. And Samanya Dharma alone doesn't explain for all the variants of Dharma or all the meanings of Dharma. And we also have Ashram Dharmas, we also have Varna Dharmas, so on. So if you look at how a life as one long continuum, it needs a mix of all of this. It needs Samanya Dharma, it needs Varna Dharma, it needs Ashrama Dharma, king will need Raja Dharma, so on. All of this is hotly contested, and that is something that even the Shankaracharya acknowledges, that we have certain problems today in understanding the traditional notion of who has adhikara, who doesn't have adhikara, and how does one acquire that adhikara, what is the role of heredity in this process. So the way tradition defines even, let's say, a word that today everybody takes for granted, there's a word called kartavya, which everybody uses, that this is my kartavya, this is something I need to do. But even a notion of a word of something like kartavya, tradition will still define it within the bounds of adhikar. So Puri Shankaracharya says, adhikar ki seema mein prapt karma hi kartavya hai. So you have an adhikar seema, which is boundaries defining that for this particular karma, this is how it should be. So you have a particular process that is defined, you have contours that are defined, and you have a notion of adhikara that is put in there. And it is that particular karma which is within those contours or boundaries of adhikara that is what is called kartavya. So again, here perhaps tradition does indeed put a lot of emphasis on heredity in certain aspects of these adhikara and certain aspects of these kartavya. What to do with that is today, how to get there, whether to get there or not, what is our position of tradition there. These are all questions that we all need to grapple with as people who are born into these times. This is a question that we all need to understand. Now, just like how there is a question on ashramas or on varnashrama dharma, there is also this another aspect on technology, which is always there when you get into these discussions on these grand, expansive notions on dharma. There's also this question on the question of technology, the philosophy of technology, and these are things that are unavoidable in a book on dharma. So again, here Puri Shankaracharya does give a lot of space onto these particular topics. But even here, there is a continuous emphasis on the role of dharma, even in this process of, let's say, science and technology. So we have a lot of luxuries, a lot of comforts that have been created today, and a lot of wants and a lot of needs that have also emerged thanks to technology. So a lot of things that were hitherto considered not possible are today possible. And that didn't stop there. It continues to create new possibilities, new wants, and new needs, so on. So it is here that Puri Shankaracharya tries to draw attention to the fact that there is an aspect of responsibility for technologies, that one person's innovation or avishkar, that should not be something that upsets the lifestyles and livelihoods of hundreds and thousands of others. So today, there isn't a lot of models that we have in place in terms of understanding the consequences of technology, the consequences of innovation, the consequences of technological adoption. So there is one statement that the Shankaracharya makes, which is very, very important for this talk today. He says this, that there is a mechanistic man today, which is a yantrapray manush, which means somebody, human, who is overtly dependent on technology. So how do we make this particular yantrapray manush, how do we convert this mechanistic man into a real human being? So this is the samasya of the times. So how do we decouple this particular mechanistic, materialistic human being and make them humans once again in the true sense? That is a formidable problem today. What does it mean to be a human is a question that needs to be asked in the context of several technological interventions that are today happening. And this is something that it's not just limited to the Hindu space. Several other scientists, scholars are also thinking about it. It is just so unfortunate that Hindus, having so much of a traditional grounding and base available, they don't seem to spend enough time in questions on philosophy of technology, questions on technological ethics, so on. So here Puri Shankaracharya says that science or Vignan today is very overtly driven by Artha and Kama. And how do we prevent this model of science and technology from destroying us? And how do we make sure that it is something that stays under the niyantran of dharma? So what he is calling for is not necessarily an anti-technology or a Luddite kind of a position. What he's really calling for is a dharma niyantrit science, which is a dharma niyantrit model in which technology operates, in which innovation operates. And that is something perhaps that needs a lot more elaboration from thinking minds in our times today. I'll just conclude here with some other parts of the book. Obviously, this is a book, let's say something that, as I mentioned at the start, it grows on you. And the charter of the book is so big that it will perhaps take hours and days of discussion, of thinking to understand the full import of this kind of a work. So the aspect of belief is important in a lot of such works and a lot of propositions in tradition. And here is where Puri Shankaracharya says there's a lot of talk on, let's say, andhavishwas, which is blind belief, superstition, or whatever we'd like to call it. But there is also this another aspect, which is andhavishwas, which means blind disbelief. That means that you just refuse to engage. Your position is to not believe. So Shankaracharya says that when you have a parampara, when you have a swasth parampara, which is a healthy living tradition, then blind belief in that sort of a healthy tradition is perhaps not as bad, because that parampara will also teach you elaboration or the explanation for those particular rituals and practices. And here he cautions that andvishwas on a swasth parampara is perhaps all right, but avishwas is absolutely not. Which is to say that I'll just reject all tradition. I am not going to believe in all of this because it doesn't sound right to me. So that is something that he cautions us against. And it is here that he quotes this very famous verse from Kalidasa's Malavikagni Mitram, something that several other scholars also have used in other contexts in the past. So this particular part in the Malakagnimitram, it says this thing that ancient poetry should not be lauded simply because ancient, and modern poetry should not be underestimated just because it is modern. And a person with a discernment or a critical mind, he'll perhaps evaluate both, but a fool will just pick up the recommendation of others. So this is the line from Kalidasa. This is how the shloka goes. And in this context, what Puri Shankaracharya says is that Kalidasa here is talking about, let's say, a blind adulation for everything past. Puri Shankaracharya also acknowledges it, that he's not saying that just because something is old, you need to just accept it. But he's contesting the opposite position, that just because something is old or just because something is a part of parampara, you'll just discard it. So he's also calling for a critical engagement with all of this, but he's just saying that don't take this opposite position of avishwas, which is a position of hate, really, to say that I've tried to cover some overview on the book, but because the book is about Sarvabhauma Sanatana Siddhanta, there are a lot of siddhantas that one sees all through the book, and I consciously avoided getting into that discussion here because that is perhaps a topic for another day. And just to give a glimpse on what these siddhantas are, these are really siddhantas that go like this: Dehantarik or Dehantarang Aneshwara Atma Siddhant, which means that this idea of Atma is something that is different from the body, but also a part of the body, and it is not something that is that gets destroyed. It is something that is immortal and stays. So this is one particular principle or siddhant on which a lot of elaboration is there on the book. Similarly, you have another siddhant which goes Purvajan or Punarjan ki siddhant. So this is about a principle or an overarching formulation on what it means to have to agree with these notions of Purvajanma and Punarjanma. And there is another siddhanta here which is of Utkraman and Adogati, which is again, this is something that I alluded to at the early part of the talk, where you have these series of progress and regress happening, where multiple different transgressions from one life form to another life form may happen. So that there is a siddhant or a formulation explaining that particular occurrence. Now, one particular siddhant here is something that I particularly liked, particularly in the context of the Mahalaya Pakshas and the Pitru Tarpan, so on. So this siddhant is called Sarva Tarpan or Poshan Siddhant. So this is a siddhant or an overarching principle where the ideal of tarpan or shraddha that is being explained. So in this part of the book, explanation of the tarpan ritual very deep, because it goes on to explain how the tarpan ritual is not just about doing something, let's say, just for the sake of doing, and it has got a long elaborate philosophical justification on the ideal of vyashti, on the ideal of samshti, which means there's a continuum between what you consider your own or one particular peculiarity, and then the overarching samshti, which is the universality. So when somebody gives tarpan as part of the ritual, they are not just giving tarpans to their pitamahas and matamahas, which is their, let's say, ancestors, forefathers on the maternal side, on the paternal side. The tarpan ritual is also much more elaborate because it is not just talking about your own lineage, it is also talking about various life forms. It is also talking about rishis. It is also talking about guru, which is a guru parampara and a lineage of gurus, so on. So even something like tarpan, if you look at it at a micro level and go deeper and deeper into it, that particular ritual alone might perhaps explain to you the entire expanse of what it means to be a Sanatana Dharmi today. So that's how really a lot of traditional and ritual spaces are explained in this book, that all of this will have a siddhant around it, and it is that siddhant which will be explained at large. Now, just to conclude, in this book, another aspect that Puri Shankaracharya emphasizes, that before somebody gets into a ninda of Sanatana Dharma, before somebody gets into a ninda of Sanatana Dharma Avalambis, which means the practitioners of Sanatana Dharma, that person needs to really critically engage and understand the ways of Dharma and the people who subscribe with the Dharma. And he should also not incorrectly attribute the failings of the followers of Dharma to the foundational or first principles. Similarly, those who are practicing or those who show their allegiance or claim their allegiance to Sanatana Dharma today, they should also remember that it is the duty of all these Sanatanis that they conduct themselves well, so that others, they start respecting and believing the ways of Dharma. It shouldn't so happen that because of the misconduct of these Sanatanis, it leads to the spread and proliferation of disrespect and disbelief in the core principles of Sanatana Dharma. So both sides carry a responsibility, that those who are, let's say, taking a very overtly critical or hate-filled positions on Sanatana Dharma, probably they also need to pause and try to understand the first principles. They try to understand the ways of the people. And even those people who claim to say that they are practitioners of Sanatana Dharma, the onus is also on them that they become the role models of what it means to be a practitioner of Sanatana Dharma. So it is this with this message that I'd like to conclude this talk. This talk is really a small tribute to the immense knowledge that the Acharya Parampara of this land holds. And I think personally that it is the prerogative of all concerned Hindus to engage seriously with tradition and what Parampara says on topics of profound importance in our times today. My pranams to Jagadguru Shankaracharya of Puri Govardhan Pitam, Swami Sri Nishalananda Saraswati ji. Thanks to Atharva Forum for providing me this opportunity.